Hi, everyone. We have just started going live. So I'd like to welcome you to our Ongage and Email Oversight co-hosted webinar. Thanks very much for joining us today. I'm Alana, and I'm Head of Customer Success at Ongage. Our webinar topic today is Blacklists, an email marketeer's guide to clean and safe mailing. And over the course of the next 45 minutes, we're going to be exploring a number of informative topics, including what are blacklists, how do they affect our email efforts, how to recognize and resolve issues with blacklists, keeping a clean and safe infrastructure, helpful tips and suggestions to keep clean and off blacklists. And this is a really relevant topic for any email marketeer, so I hope that you find today's session to be insightful. Some of you have already found the panel on the right-hand side of your screen, which is a chat box. Please feel free to submit your questions and chat during the session. We're going to be having a number of check-ins, both during the session as well as the end of the presentation, to answer questions that might come up. As well, I'd like to let you know that this session is being recorded. So if you would like to review the presentation again, or to share with your friends, don't worry. At the end of the session, a recording is available in the same link that you've entered this crowdcast through, and as well as that, we'll be emailing the link afterwards. For those of you who may not be familiar as yet with Ongage, just before we do get started, Ongage is a complete solution to manage email marketing operations. We provide for a separation of the Ongage platform front end from the delivery vendor backend. So essentially that allows you flexibility to select your vendor of choice and easily route mailings by multiple delivery systems. As well, you're able to manage lists, campaigns, complete segmentation, and more. We won't be looking at the Ongage platform in this session, but at the end of the presentation, if you'd like to find out more, please feel free to contact us. So without further ado, to get us started, I would like to introduce Brian Jenkins. Brian is Director of Sales at Email Oversight. Email Oversight, just to let you know, in case you may not be familiar with this company, they provide advanced list cleaning, email validation, threat assessment, and data append services in a user-friendly solution. Brian today brings a wealth of experience from the email marketing industry, particularly in email validation and hygiene-related products and services. So without further ado, Brian, over to you.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Like Alana said, my name is Brian Jenkins. I've been in the email marketing industry for the last going on 14 years. The primarily last 10 years has been focused on the hygiene and validation side of things. So today with Ongage, we want to kind of give you guys a general overview on blacklists as a whole, how it pertains to email marketing, what to look for, how to resolve, and sort of how it pertains in the overall grand scheme of things with regards to email marketing. So we're going to focus our attention, a lot of this on some slides. We're going to try to get into more of an interactive discussion about it. I'll keep a good look on the sidebar if you guys have some questions on specific slides. After each slide, if it's not too many questions, I'll touch on some topics. I can elaborate more on some subjects. I'll try to make it as, interactive as I possibly can without going over the hour. Otherwise, I'll get slapped on the hand. So I'm going to turn my camera off. We'll start focusing on the presentation, and I hope you guys enjoy. So let's start very simply. What is a blacklisting? Everybody's familiar with the term. Everyone's heard the term. But how does it now pertain specifically just by definition? So a blacklisting is when your sending IP address and/or your mailing domains have been listed or blocked on an anti-spam system, service, or network. If this occurs, it can restrict or block an email marketer from sending a message to an intended recipient, or block all mail from being delivered at all. The main reason for your blacklistings is to block spam, quote unquote. However, filtering out real spammers compared to legitimate mail, it seems to be quite a difficult task for a lot of these major anti-spam networks. At the end of the day, the term blacklisting has kind of taken its own life. I like focusing my attention on blacklistings as a whole. when it comes to two major areas or two major topics. So the first topic that we're going to talk about is anti-spam sites. Anti-spam sites, like the area that I focus on here, like a spam cop or a spam house or something very specific to an anti-spam network itself, has more to do with the blacklisting of your IPs and domains on these particular sites. Whereas the second half of the conversation or the presentation is going to be focused on more ISP-based blacklisting or blocking, when it's not a specific anti-spam site or service doing the blacklisting, more the actual ISP itself. So going over anti-spam sites as a whole, DNSBL sites, domain name systems blacklists. If you guys are familiar with anti-spam sites, you've probably seen the term DNSBL out there. Anti-spam blacklists that allow a website admin to block messages from specific systems that have a history of sending spam. So these companies are built out with the intention of targeting quote-unquote spam operations and then blacklisting them on their sites. Their listings are purely based on DNS, which converts IPs into domain names, making it easier to read, use, and research. The only way they can find you is by utilizing things like traps and complainers and stuff like that. But the reason that they can cross-reference and research is using their DNS that they're finding all of the relevant information to research on. If the owner of that DNS blacklist has received spam or has a history of spam coming in from specific IPs or domains, that server or domain could be blacklisted or will be blacklisted, and all messages sent either will be flagged or rejected from all the sites that observe that blacklist as harmful. This is all real dependent on specific blacklists, what their intentions are, what their core value is trying to showcase. It's important to know that there's a variety of different blacklists out there when it comes to anti-spam sites, and we'll touch on those throughout the presentation. But just to get a general definition and a general sort of overview, and I know for some of you guys this is very rudimentary, so bear with me. We'll get into some more detail about this stuff, but it is important for everyone to kind of get a grasp, specifically on the first part of the discussion points for the anti-spam site side of things when with regards to blacklists. So a DNS blacklist. What makes up a DNS blacklist? First thing you have to have, obviously, is a domain to host. You have to have a server to host and control that domain, and then you have to have a list of email addresses to publish that list and collect information. That's where the discussion point of traps and moles all take place. I use this sort of the most famous of the anti-spam site blacklists or the DNS-based blacklists on spam house side of things because everyone's sort of very familiar with it. Obviously, there's a very vast majority out there. There's over 400 or 500 different anti-spam sites or blacklists out there. Some are more prevalent than others within the space and hold more clout. But I just use Spam House as an example here because they host, they control, and they operate under this domain. That's the core part of why a DNS-based blacklist is so detrimental to your mailing operations, because they control and operate basically all the listings that occur within their site itself. Popular DNSBL sites. I'm going to leave this slide up. If you guys want to copy a couple of these down, obviously you guys are going to get a copy of this anyways, but I just thought it would be good from just a recognition standpoint, just to see some of the relevant anti-spam systems and services that are out there that you would be recognizing as you're looking at the reputation of your IPs and domains. You'd probably see, one of a number of these across the board. If you were looking at if your domain or your IP was listed somewhere, if you had, reputation-based problems. And I won't keep it up too long because I know that we want to start getting into some questions and things as we're going along. But I do want people to recognize a lot of the namings that are on here. So anti-spam sites and anti-spam services have all different standards and criteria for both listing and delisting. So each site is going to be very different. They all have their own methods of use, right? So the point of every anti-spam system or service is to combat spam in some way. They want to, rid the world, if you will, of spamming operations. But every site is observed differently. And what I mean by that is every site has its own clout within the industry. So the spam houses, the spam cops, the URIBL sites or the URI sites of the world, that's all going to be viewed in a much higher regard with regards to reputation and delivery than it would be if it was just Joe Bag of Donuts, a small little anti-spam shop that has a few seeds and lists you on their blog. They don't have obviously the same effect per se as somebody of the spam house or the spam cop of the world. So when you're looking at your issues per se, it's important to know that each one of those sites holds a different regard within the email space itself or within the industry of itself. So you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with the importance of those different sites and how they are viewed within the reputation world. Some of those sites are going to be stricter than others, and what I mean by that is some of them have different criteria for listing. So somebody like, let's say, a spam house of the world may be collecting information over time to list you on their site after various different sends over, say, 2-3 month period of time, whereas spam cop, let's just use for example, may list you on the first send to a person who's severely complaining to them about being sent too frequently, or the content was not what they expected. So it's also not only as important to look for things like how are these anti-spam systems or services or sites viewed in the industry, but also what thresholds are they taking, or what measures are they taking with receiving that information, and how am I being listed, or how long is it taking for me to be listed. The different listing standards also mean you have different delisting practices. So in other words, once you're listed on some of these websites or some of these anti-spam systems, there's different delisting protocols. The delisting protocols is going to be different per site that you're listed on, and we're going to go into this in the next slide. So I don't want to confuse anybody too much, but the reason I bring it up is you have to follow the protocol on each site in order to try to get your resources delisted from those websites. So the first thing is always a manual delisting. You can go to their delisting URLs. You can fill out their forms. Sometimes it's as simple as just a quick email, IP, and reason for delisting. Other times it's a bit more resource intensive. They want to know more information to confirm that you're obviously a legitimate operation. But those are what we would call manual delisting practices. Delisting practices, a lot of times these websites will list you just because it fits their criteria or hits certain thresholds. And if you wait, it'll auto delist it after a few days. Sometimes it's a few hours, sometimes it's a few weeks. Again, everything's different, and it's also dependent on the situation, but an auto delisting is a part of that as well. You want to make sure that you read up on those sites to see what those practices are. They may tell you just no sending for a few days so that they can reset the resources, something like that. The worst of the worst would be more of a no delisting scenario. There are websites out there that do not want you to be delisted from them. Sometimes, and we'll use a very extreme case, if you have a Roxo listing, let's just say, you're never going to get off. I mean, I think I can count on 2 fingers the people that I know that have ever gotten off that. It's going to be very difficult to sort of recover for something like that, but we'll touch onto that into some other slides just so you can understand sort of the different practices that are involved. But the 3 main areas on the standards for delisting are always going to be manual, auto, and God forbid, the non-delistings. So what we're going to do real quick is we're going to show you how to check to see if you're blacklisted. So we're going to share a screen, and we're going to go and we're going to use, we want you guys to be able to copy these URLs down first and foremost. So they'll be available obviously after the call, but the first URL we're going to use is one of my favorites to use for everybody is mxtoolbox.com. So MX Toolbox allows you, it's a free site, you go, and it allows you to check the health of your IPs and your domains. Since most DNS-based blacklists are going to focus on listing the IPs and or the domains, it's a perfect tool to get a good overview about how you're listed. So what we're going to do is Elena's going to actually take this URL and she's going to share it on the screen, and then we're going to go through checking the health of a specific IP. So if we look up here, we're going to add this a single IP in the Blacklist check button. So you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, it allows us to look at these different variable tabs, and this one specifically is going to be blacklists. So the first one we're going to do is we're going to put the IP in, and then we're going to hit the Blacklist check, and then that little gear is going to wind down while it manually real-time checks every blacklist that they use. So you can see that it'll list all of your listed IPs, or in this case, it'll show you all the sites that you're listed on first. It'll put them in red up top, and then it'll tell you all the sites that they've checked and you're okay on. And then it'll also tell you if there's any sites on the bottom that timed out. Timeouts have nothing to do with you guys, and I see like there's a couple of comments about timeouts. It's specific on the ability for that site to receive the information on that IP in order to do the proper check on it. The ones that usually matter the most are never going to time out. You're never going to see, like, hypothetically, a spam house time out on you. I would say it would almost never happens. The major blacklists tend to be the most responsive. If you scroll to the bottom of it real quick, you can see when we get to the timeout areas, a lot of these are like, I probably have seen them on cleaning reports more than I've seen people have issues with them. So most of the time, you can assume it's not going to give you a massive reputation-based problem unless there's just some delivery footprint that's focusing their attention hypothetically on, Swinog. The most responsive anti-spam sites are always going to give you the most trouble. So MX Toolbox is one of the best tools to use. Rafi, a good question. Email service providers should be able to give you the IPs that you're mailing from. So if you're unaware of your own mailing infrastructure, in other words, the IP that you're using and the domain groupings that you're using or however it's set up, just ask your rep and they should be able to give it to you, and then you can manually check your blacklistings on these as well. Some ESPs do it for you. I know more full service ESPs that are having more of a hands-on approach, they may check that for you as well. To name a few off the top of my head, I know like eMercury, for example. I know Mike and his team are really good about doing their diligence on IP reputation and domain reputation so that they can relay the information back to you to adjust your list hygiene or your list practices. But if you're unsure if your email service provider, or even if you're using like a custom MTA, if they give that information to you, you can 100% get that info from them and do the manual checks for them. Jim, does Sorbs spam? It does. It's not as prevalent as it used to be. Most of these anti-spam sites that aren't as strong within the industry are still useful resource tools for companies like Spamhaus and SpamCop. So a common misconception is, does anybody that only Sorbs focuses on their own listing, or if there's something listed in SpamCop, that doesn't mean that all the other sites are paying attention. Most of these sites communicate with each other in some capacity. A lot of them use these smaller listings as precursor listings to the larger sites. So for example, Spamhaus will look at Sorbs listings. They'll look at Host Karma listings. They'll look at SpamCop listings. They'll look at trends and see if it's the same resources being hit over and over. They'll look at other anti-spam systems as a point of reference to help them provide enough information to do a listing. I've seen cases where Spamhaus, you have zero presence within the Spamhaus network itself, and it's all predicated on pre-listings coming from any of those various sites that you could see below, because they pay attention to all of those sites. Hopefully that answers your question without going too far over it. So these are IP-based blacklists. There's also domain-based blacklists. Common misconception is, oh, if my IP is clean, my domain is clean. That's not the case. There are domain exclusive owned blacklists. You usually get them together. It doesn't always mean that it can't be one and not the other. It's just a common misconception. So Elena, if you scroll back up to the top here, let's go into the same Blacklist Check toolbar, and let's just put in Ongage.com. So we're going to click the blacklists again. Perfect. So same concept. It'll run through. It's going to tell you all the domain-based blacklists that your domain potentially could be listed on or is not listed on. Your resources are your livelihood when it comes to mail, so it's really important not to just check one and not the other. You got to make sure you check both. If you have multiple, they do have API capabilities on this. I'm not the most technical person in the world, so it's probably a webinar for somebody more technical, but you see the concept here. You can see all of the different domain-based blacklists on here. Again, Sorbs, Spamhaus, DBL, SurBL. You'll see URI on here, Barracuda's domain-based blacklists and stuff. So again, this is a really good a tool for you guys as a lookup. There's also a second tool, more for IP-based blacklists, but I also like to use it sometimes. Like somebody was mentioned before, they always get timeouts. It's always good to have a secondary tool. We can go in here and we can do the same concept check. So we're just take the same IP. We'll scroll to the middle of the site. We'll put it into the sample, check my IP. And then we'll be able to check every IP-based blacklist that this site will check on and confirm if you're on any specific IP-based blacklists. This does not have a domain check. There are some other domain level checks that you can use out there. I'm not a huge proponent of using multiple domain level checks just because the IP ones are a little bit more broad. So using MX Toolbox for just domain level stuff is usually fine. I mean, if you have secondary ones, it's okay. But you don't have to kill yourself over trying to find 3 or 4 different sources of domain-based checks and IP-based checks. Having 1 or 2 is more than fine. So if we click back over to the presentation, again, I want everyone to be able to copy these down if you're not using them. If you are using them, obviously you guys are head up on the game. You know where to look up your things. So from here, how did I get listed? Being in the hygiene industry, I get asked this question more than any other question in the world. First and foremost, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with it, spam traps. Your list quality is the #1 lead-in to anything related to anti-spam sites and services. Manish, just so you know, it does and it does not. Some Gmail does look at it into some capacity, but it's not the end-all be-all. It will affect the delivery on there, especially if you have IPs and domains that are blacklisted at a high-level anti-spam site. But if you're only mailing Gmail addresses per se, or just major ISPs, a lot of these anti-spam sites and services from like a trap level aren't really pertinent because they don't have a high vantage, or I should say, a unique purview on that stuff. It's very much more specific to GI data from the quality side of things. But for pure deliverability purposes, Gmail will look at some of those blacklists, and obviously if you're listed on some of the higher leveled ones, they will block. So your spam traps, again, most common ways any email marketer is going to get listed on an anti-spam sites. They're purpose-built. Their email address is designed to collect info, but upon receiving those mail, they have to determine whether or not they need to blacklist to combat those spam techniques. So First question I always get asked is, I hit a spam trap, am I automatically going to be listed on that anti-spam service? The answer is no. Everybody, they need to collect information in order to determine whether or not it's important. Can it happen? Of course. Anything can happen when it comes to spam traps. But you have to follow, they usually follow a protocol. They have to develop a trend, or they have to give you some semblance of information or research to prove out why they're doing what they're doing. Second question I always get asked, I'm mailing only AOL and Yahoo and Gmail, should I worry about those types of spam traps? They won't have as big of a presence. They are much more of a GI-based creation. Can they seed major ISPs? Of course, but it's just not, they're a technology-based company. They need to have their own massive amounts of infrastructure seeds, like in other words, on a domain level, in order to collect the information they want to collect. Secondarily, complaints. The general complaint about receiving mails, obviously everybody's commonly they know that that's an occurrence that's going to happen when you're sending mail. But what you want to avoid and what you want to mitigate are your habitual complaints from the same users over and over and over again, because those complaints can be forwarded onto major DNSBL or anti-spam sites, because those sites are out looking for mole network type of solutions where they can utilize information coming from high-level complainers and siphon that information, almost like a feedback loop, if you will. Siphon that information back to that anti-spam site and build out. Spam Cop and Barracuda have massive mole networks when it comes to complaints. They'll literally utilize complaint-driven information just as much as they use trap information. So you can always look secondarily at your complaints versus your traps if you're curious about how you're getting listed. Resource sharing. A lot of you guys are on ESPs, and so if you're sharing a pool of IPs with other email marketers, in some cases, their poor sending habits or practices or data quality can negatively impact the resources that you guys are all using. So while you guys haven't done anything wrong specifically, somebody else in that pool has, and so it's causing what's called a drive-by listing, where they're targeting one specific IP or multiple IPs from one user, but instead of just nailing those, they nailed everything as a safety point. So it's common, it happens a lot. So those are usually your three main culprits, if you will, about how you got listed. So what's my impact? It's pretty straightforward. First and foremost, poor IP and domain health. You get listed, you're going to have very, very, very bad IP and domain reputation and health. With that comes bad sender reputation. You're going to start to have poor deliverability overall. It's going to take a negative impact on your sending habits and how your ability to deliver at all. And then you're eventually going to get blocked from delivery. If you guys are mailing on an ESP, more than likely you're going to get kicked off or suspended on that ESP, especially if they're monitoring high-level trap hits or listings themselves, which most do. If you're not mailing on ESP and you're doing something more of a custom MTA, or you have your own resources, but you plug and play into different ESPs, and so it's more controlled on your own side, those resources eventually will get burned. And when they have burned resources, you're not going to have as high amount of delivery. It's going to slowly deter, or it's going to slowly kind of give you attrition on your delivery metrics as a whole, and then eventually you're just not going to have any footprint whatsoever there. Before I go to the next slide, I'll try to answer this one question here. Shared IP pools and a submit request to be delisted, would it be approved? It can be. It depends on the anti-spam site. So some anti-spam sites, as long as you give them the specific IPs that some will ask you which IPs of the range they listed are yours, and then based on that information, they may delist because they know that the original issue did not come from that. If it's a site that's just looking to block an entire range because it's habitually being abused, they may not approve that delisting request. So it's sort of it's a hybrid. So you can submit that request, and they may ask you for the specific IPs, and they may delist it. But if it's being abused, you're not going to be able to move past that point if that's just their threshold. Do academic institutions tend to have their own spam filters on their email servers? 550, 571s, client host rejected, connection rejected. Yes and no. So some academic institutions employ their own systems as a service. So they have their own security platforms, but that's basically their own security filtering systems. And that's why you're getting those filtering errors. That's not related specifically, though, to anti-spam systems or services. That's more security-based services and filtering technologies. So like network protected style domains, most EDU, if you most colleges or any EDUs have their own filtering technology, whether it's their own proprietary or they're using like a Postini or a Message Labs or something like that. So we got blacklisted. We kind of touched on this a little bit. I'll leave the slide up for a second just in case anybody has any questions, but I'm going to try to power through because we still have another half here that we want to go through. But every site has their own delisting windows. You go in through, you enter the information that they need. Again, we touched on this in a few slides ago, and we kind of we beat it a little bit more with regards to some of the questions that you guys had. But you really don't know how long it's going to take to get a reply in some instances. You don't know how long it's going to take. Some give you very straightforward instruction on exactly how long things should take in terms of reply and being able to delist as a whole. Some don't, and you're just sitting and waiting for quite a long period of time. So I wanted to put the slide in there just so you understood, but we talked about it in at good length prior to that. So if you can't delist and you're mailing on your own personal resources and you're just not getting good deliverability footprint at this point, and your metrics aren't going up, 9 times out of 10 you're going to have to reshuffle out that, get new IPs, get new domains, and build out that infrastructure back from scratch. If you're using an ESP, that's why it's really good to have multiple ESPs, because not only if you get blocked from using that ESP or blocked from deliverability on that ESP, but if your account gets suspended or shut down, you're going to need to have something else to use. And so that's why I'm not a massive fan of using just a single entry point. If you're not using ESPs and you have your own resources and they're not being delisted, or they're just habitually being landing on all these anti-spam sites as a whole, you're going to have to get new resources and do the old churn and burn. Again, is it going to be as prolific in the major ISPs as it will be with the GI-based data? No, but you still have to understand, these resources have a shelf life, and if you're not taking care of them and they're continuously being blocked, you're going to have to rebuild out that infrastructure at some point. So, okay, we've talked about anti-spam site, blacklisting and blocking, and the detriments to mail at that point. Now let's talk about ISP blocking and blacklisting. So outside of anti-spam networks and DNSBL sites, you can still run into blocking issues for major ISPs due to poor sender reputations, high complaints, high hard bounces, and low list quality. So we're done sort of talking about the anti-spam sites at this point, and now let's talk about major ISPs and how they view poor sender quality and poor IP and domain reputation as it comes to their entryway, and how that's going to pertain to your mailing efforts as a whole. So for starters, all ISPs are looking at your hard bounce rates. You want to avoid obviously sending to your undeliverable email addresses. You want to keep that sender reputation high. The more you validate your users and keep sending to your deliverable emails, the better standing you're always going to be in your major ISPs. So you will just use Microsoft or Oath for any of those. Yahoo, if you're sending to such a high amount of undeliverables, Yahoo's not going to keep letting you send. They're just going to stop. They're just going to block you completely. So you want to make sure that you're sending to pristine data when it comes to the deliverability aspect. You can always keep your hard bounces at a minimum. It's fine. But just make sure that you're eliminating them prior to sending, and if you do send to a hard bounce, eliminate them at the time of send so you're not resending to the same hard bounce over and over again. It's usually a massive red flag. Much like with anti-spam sites, those ISPs are also looking at complainers. They want to see if you're sending, too much of a content or too much of something to a specific user who's complaining, complaining that they can't unsubscribe because it's not set up properly. You want to make sure that you're paying attention to the content you're sending, but also the frequency of that content, and avoid sending to someone that's continuously complaining. All major ISPs take that into consideration, and it will be a judgment point on whether or not they allow the continuous delivery. We're not talking about inboxing versus junking at this point. We're talking about the ability to deliver the message, period. Is that all of this stuff will play a factor and a role, because it's not at this point, these ISPs are not blacklisting you in the same sense that they have a website that now your IPs and your domains are sitting there being blacklisted. Now they're blocking you. They're basically saying, well, too much stuff is coming from this individual user. Now we're not going to send it. We're not going to allow the delivery of that specific domain, or that specific domain and IP, because of quote unquote high hard bounces or high complaints. The third metric you want to avoid is dormant accounts and inactive accounts. As you guys are mailing, understand that email addresses are dynamic by nature. So over time, they're going to change. So as you're mailing, keep track of non-engaged or non-active email addresses. Don't continually send them over and over and over with the hope that at some point they'll engage. There's a happy medium between revamping your creative and attempting to send something to get an engagement than continually beating a dead horse on an email address that's never opened, never clicked, or responded in any way. By doing that, over time, you're removing non-engaged users and then also avoiding dormant accounts. And dormant accounts is a really big placate, because dormant accounts are basically the major ISP's version of spam traps. So all major ISPs are using dormant accounts, which are accounts that haven't logged in for a period of time, and they use them as a tool to disable and reactivate them for monitoring purposes. So obviously, the same concept as a spam trap, you want to use some semblance of trap technology to collect information. Well, how do you do that? Major ISPs do it by reactivating accounts that have not logged in after a long period of time. So now, the most sort of recognizable ISP that does this, because you can track it, is Microsoft. Microsoft is one of the more prolific groups of domains that will do that type of technology. They use the method to power their Smart Defense Data Services, or their SNDS program. If you're familiar with mailing to Microsoft, then you'll know a lot about the SNDS program. If you're not, then just understand that Microsoft, this program, as insight on how subscribers rate their emails they're receiving, looks at the health of the IPs sending mail, and then it views the actual emails being sent to the Microsoft email addresses. So as a mailer, you can subscribe to this SNDS reports and review your spam complaints, your filter results, and your spam trap hits. It's a really good tool if you're mailing to Microsoft domains, because it allows you the ability to view your list quality with regards to any of the Microsoft domains you're mailing. And if it says you have a high trap count, you want to continue a list. Correct. It does show the number of trap hits. So it's going to tell you how many traps have we hit. It's going to tell you how many complaints you're hitting. And that's another good point. It's not going to tell you which emails are traps. That's your job as an end user, and we'll touch on this later. That's your job as an end user to do a good job of hygiene on that data. And if that means you've cleaned it once at some point through a vendor, that means you're going to have to go back again, because it kind of goes back to the point of the dynamic parts of email addresses. Data over time is going to see attrition, so you want to address that attrition by continual cleanings. You can assume that on a 30 to 45-day trend, if not sooner, dormant accounts are going to get turned over into trap accounts. And this is not just for Microsoft, it's for every domain. Every domain's different in the conversion, but it's going to be important that you follow along with that conversion. So if you're reprocessing data on, say, a 30 or a 45-day trend, you'll eliminate a good majority of, and we'll just use Microsoft as an example, a majority of those SNDS trap hits. It's not going to always resolve them to zero, but if you're hitting hypothetically 25, you're for sure going to get it down into the single digits. And as long as you continue that process of reclaim, you'll eventually weed it out with external hygiene and internal hygiene with non-engagers. So great question, and it was a good point to make in regards to trap hits and how you can view them but not see the specifics. other than numbers, I mean. So like we talked about before, or quickly talked about before, every ISP, or that we call them major ISPs, but the top level domains are all doing this, but only Microsoft shows you. So Microsoft obviously has their SNDS traps, and that's just something that you can view and you can kind of get a grip on. But the other ISPs are just going to convert these dormant accounts into active monitoring accounts, or trap accounts if you want to call them that, and to enable all the insight onto whether you as the mailer's sending practices, content, or general list upkeep is deserving of that delivery. These accounts, if you continually mail to them, will get you blocked. It's a certainty. It will eventually happen. Every ISP is different. You're not going to know the threshold of how many of these accounts you're hitting in order to get blocked, but it's a combination effort, and it's really good to have, again, an internal hygiene regiment that removes non-engaged users to avoid these eventual conversions of accounts, but also a third-party hygiene vendor or a third-party cleaning vendor to eliminate them at the start as well. So you don't want to get blacklisted from these ISPs by sending to dormant accounts, because it's not just Microsoft that's using that trap technology type of effort. So how do we prevent getting on these blacklists or block lists with regards specifically to both anti-spam systems and, of course, major ISPs? Proper lead generation first and foremost. I mean, we have this conversation with so many different vendors. There's definitely different schools of thought, and I'm not here to tell you how to collect your leads, whether you're doing something via site submissions, whether you're doing something via co-reg, whether you're doing something via third-party monetization of somebody else's data. It doesn't really matter. There just needs to be a good practice of lead generation techniques by validating at the point of lead. And what that means is you need to collect the lead and validate the lead prior to it going into your mailer. So whether that means using a third party to validate it, confirm that it's deliverable and clean before you send to it, whether that means you do that and then a combination of sending a confirmation-based email on your non-production mailing, or maybe that means that you're double opting. It really doesn't matter the specifics, other than some combination of proper lead generation techniques. If you're not doing first party and you're doing a lot of third party, it doesn't change the technique. Data acquisition and maintenance is still a combination level thing. You need to do both. So if you're organically generating your leads, it's going to yield more of a safer collection method, but over time, that collection method still needs maintenance. But if you flip the script a little bit and you're working with maybe third-party vendors or third-party trusted partners, you're still going to need to address the diligence on that data. So validating your newly acquired users post-collection, because remember, you're not collecting these at point of lead. You're getting them fed maybe through a third-party vendor or through a third-party source. Validating those prior to getting into your mailer or into your ESP. But then also, once you're mailing, monitor and exclude your inactive users. I mean, this is kind of a common theme, and you'll hear it a million times over from me specifically. But if you're not actively looking at what's engaging and not engaging, and I'm not talking about within the first 30 days, I'm talking about long term, then you're going to continually send to non-active emails, and that's not a good thing, because you want to avoid those converted dormant accounts, abandoned accounts that are now hard bounces, and it's all going to negatively impact your ability to send. So at the end of the day, implement as much of your own internal hygiene by eliminating a lot of the inactive and non-engaged accounts, because it's going to remove a lot of the dormant account threats that created over time and a lot of the hard bounces that will eventually be let in there for accounts that are not engaged. The big sort of end point that I'll drive home is, if you guys got to have a validation and hygiene methodology applied, and whether that's on the front end where you collect your leads, you vet them internally, and then process them through a vendor like email oversight, or if it's on the back end and you're collecting leads and validating them prior to importing them into your system. At the end of the day, that's the first sort of line of defense that you have against anything related specifically to both anti-spam systems and services, and also ISP level blocking and blacklisting, because the original data you're getting in needs to get cleaned prior to the first send. But what's equally as important is your periodic cleaning of that email. So as you're deploying, it's great internally that you're vetting out your unengaged users and your active users. But active users doesn't necessarily mean it's a good activity. A lot of this stuff you can do, you can see the attrition on the active users as well. So what you want to do is you want to implore a real-time aspect in a maintenance-driven type scenario where every 30 or 45 days, and some people can stretch it to 60, but you're re-cleaning your active data. You're re-cleaning the data that you're going to be proactively mailing so that you can eliminate the newly created threats or the newly created issues. Jonathan, I'll hit your question there because it's a good lead-in. If you're using your email oversight or any other vendor in real time on a data capture page, do you recommend accepting verified addresses only? In the B2C world, yes, only verified. In the B2B world, I would say catch-all is the only other status you might want to look into, and we can have this conversation offline because it'll be a longer than 15 or 14 minutes, which is all we have left. But in theory, the verified users is really the only thing that I would recommend to accept if you're looking for the most pristine data to implement into your mailing. Shalini, if we use email oversight in real time, how often should the data be re-cleaned? 2 months, 6 months? I usually will recommend 60 days as a minimum. If you want to be very aggressive, 30 days is probably best practice, but 60 days is usually fine. I would say the majority of my clients and even clients that I've talked to over the years is some semblance between 30 and 90. I would not go longer than 90. The data, especially on data that you're mailing, if you're actively mailing something, don't take the risk on it just because it's active in your system hypothetically, or if you have a good grip on your data. It doesn't mean that it's good engagement. You want to make sure that you're still doing your diligence on that data as you're proactively sending to your quote unquote actives or engaged. So we'll leave kind of the contact information up here. I'll open it up to questions at this point if anybody wants to touch on any subjects that we missed in terms of different slides or just elaborating on some different topics. I'm happy to go and review anything that you guys are ready. We have about 12 minutes left, so I'll leave this page up, and I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming into the webinar. Hopefully it was informative and you guys got a good read on sort of how the blacklists pertain both onto the anti-spam systems and also the major ISPs. If you have any questions for me directly, my contact info is there, and for Elena directly, hers is here as well. Jim, I'll read yours now. So does Yahoo or Gmail offer something similar to Hotmail SNDS? They do not. You can follow their feedback loops and stuff to see what your complaints and other such things, but they don't have an SNDS report. So you're not going to be able to see, your high trap hits per se or any of that sort of relevant information that Microsoft offers. It doesn't mean that they don't have those types of issues. It just means that they don't showcase a monitoring-based system like Microsoft does. I wish they did, because it would be a whole lot better for me, and I could help people out directly with any problems they might have specifically with those domains, but unfortunately they don't. We have about 10 minutes, guys, so if you guys have anything else, we'll use that 10 minutes up for end-of-the-line questioning or anything specific. Shalini, the biggest blacklists, I would say your biggest blacklists, for sure, if I'm ranking them per se, I would give you Spamhaus as a 1, Spam Cop as a 2, and then I would say some combination of Host Karma, SURBL, URIBL, and while Sorbs isn't majorly prevalent, but because it's a precursor, I would say that that's in the top. Things like people bring up like Barracuda, let's say, or Cloud Marks and those types. They're dangerous to a point, but their practices for delisting and all of that stuff seem to be a bit easier to work through, and they're not as eye-catching when you look at them and go, oh, I got a Spamhaus listing versus the rest. So those would be my biggest ones, as I would say. Raghav, How often should the data be recleaned? Like I said before, recleaning data every 30 to 60 days. I wouldn't go more than quarterly for any of that, especially for your active stuff. Advice for nonprofits. It's for you guys. I would say it's the same for everybody else in the mailing industry. Just, watch your lead generation and implore a good hygiene regimen on the top. What you're mailing doesn't really pertain specifically unless it's something nefarious. It's really just the data acquisition methods and keeping an eye on your IP and domain health. So checking out those resources and making sure that everything looks okay. What do you say here? When notice your IP and domain got blacklisted, instead of leaving them, what practice can you do to save the IP and domain? It depends on the actual blacklists themselves. If they're blacklisted on smaller threat-based anti-spam sites or blacklists, you can work your sending reputation back up as long as it's not having a negative impact on your deliverability footprint. So in other words, if you're still seeing as you're sending a very small deliverability footprint, like you're getting blocked, let's say, or it's deferring for some strange reason, there's really not much you can do to increase your domain and your IP health. Attempt for your delistings and all that stuff is going to be always a helpful helpful trick, but you still have to measure which blacklistings you're hitting. If it's something major like a spam house, there's abandonment at that point is going to be a lot easier than trying to delist and stay off that radar. Chris, I'll just use yours real quick while we have it. Is it necessary to request for delisting if the domain is constantly blacklisted, even if the domain has no activity? In some cases, if you guys are registering your domains, it can auto list if you are not holding on to the resources. Like if you, in other words, if you register a domain, let's say, and then turn it online and set it up automatically apply to an IP, and you're not mailing it actively, you'll get automatically listed either on a DBL or a day old bread or a spam eating monkey. Those domain-based blacklists are literally created just to see which domains get registered and then put online. You don't have to delist it if you don't want to, but most domain-based listings can cross-reference into IP-based blacklistings. So in other words, if you're listed on let's say spam eating monkey or day old bread, which is like a very common domain-based blacklist that's very consistent, if you apply that to an IP and then you attempt to send, there's a good chance over time that day old bread or that spam eating monkey listing will catch the wind of somebody else, and then they could just cross-reference the domain to the IP and list the IP. So the short answer is you don't have to, but I would if you plan on mailing to that at some point. Jim, sender's IP blacklist matter as much as the sender's domain reputation. Which has more priority on inboxing? Inboxing is kind of a different discussion. I would say blacklists on the IP side will at some point affect your domain reputation because they are cross-referenced. If you are allocating an IP to a domain on your sending side, at some point they have the same info. So while you may not be on, say, an IP blacklist, if your domain is, like going back to Chris's point, at some point they might cross-reference and vice versa. So it's less about priority on inboxing and more just priority on reputation as a whole. I would say IP reputation sometimes can win the argument of having more clout over domain reputation, but it all depends on the specific ISP that you're trying to send or inbox into. But again, inboxing wise, I would say that's a completely different beast. It has more to do with deliverability as a whole versus inboxing, because there are outside factors for that. We have about 5 more minutes, guys. So if anybody else wants to chime in and ask anything, does high unsubscribe rate affect domain reputation? And if yes, what percentage would you keep as good? So this is a good question, and I don't necessarily know if I can answer it specifically because I don't have a use case for it. But if you have a high unsubscribe rate, sometimes your IP and your domain reputation can be a bit lower, and your deliverability metrics can be a bit lower over time, because whatever content you're sending is going to be an issue. It's clearly the issue, and that's why your unsub rates are so high. So I mean, I wouldn't be keeping any of my unsubscribes, but it definitely can affect your reputation at your sending reputation over time. Yes. Can email oversight remove spam traps from the email list? Yes, we can. That's part of the hygiene feature and the threat assessment feature. So not only do we do things in real time for validation, but we also remove your spam traps, high-level complainers, bots, and things that are going to be more nefarious on the reputation side. Can you explain a little bit more about what a catch-all verification status means? Yes. So a catch-all status means that the domain in question has a setting on the MTA level, the mailing level, that's basically telling us that they accept all mail for every recipient. So from a validation standpoint, when you're using the ping technology like we use, the ping technology can only get to a certain status code, which in this case is their front level of catch-all. So with regards to how do you treat catch-all statuses, usually our play for those is if you are mailing B2B versus B2C, you always want to have a second layer of validation implored, which means a secondary non-production mail you can send to your catch-all and then drip in the deliverable email addresses to your production data. If it's B2C, it's usually a lot more GI, sort of non-good domains. If you have good transactional history on them, or you know the users, you can continually send to them. 9 times out of 10, most mailers don't, because they're not mailing a ton of GI if you're not mailing to B2B. I hope that it elaborates a little bit more on it. All right, we have 3 minutes, so we can maybe hammer out 1 or 2 more if you guys have any.
Okay, Brian, you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay, super. It seems like we have come to the end. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining the session and for all your questions. If you do have any further questions, or you'd like to reach out to Brian or myself directly for more information about Ongage or email oversight services, you have our contact information on the screen that was up a moment ago, and also we'll be sending out an email after this session. As well, if you'd like to access any more educational webinars on email marketing, Ongage does have a YouTube page, so feel free to search for Ongage in YouTube, or to follow us on LinkedIn as well to see interesting email marketing posts and hear about other future webinar events. Thank you very much for everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much, Brian, especially for sharing your insights with us today. And thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, we appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much.
Okay.